How you doing, bud? So it'll all be timed.
All right.
All right, I just need this for the clock.
Appellate Judges Conference. I was asked to go from moderator. Yes, just want to make sure that wasn't outlined. It's very short. Just go and start talking. Morning, everybody. Think we're going to go ahead and get started. So, my name is Ethan Jeans, and I'm a 3L here at Colorado Law. I'm the current editor-in-chief of the Colorado Technology Law Journal. And before the next panel, I've been asked to say a few quick words about the journal. So, it's been a strong year for us. We have printed 3 issues so far since September, done a variety of things, including a new name, new logo, an acronym hopefully at least a few of you can remember. But looking further ahead, we did hope to use this as a chance to ask you for a couple things moving forward. The first one is to start throwing rocks at telecom attorney. Oh, no, wait, that's what Professor Ohms just said. That is not what we want. So for friends and alums of the journal, if you're interested in staying in contact, if you're interested in seeing where we're going moving forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years, please do sign up for our newsletter online. It's ctlj.colorado.edu. And second, we are starting to actively solicit new papers now, as well as looking for blog posts for a new practitioner blog series we are getting ready to start. So if that's of any interest to you, please grab me, any other member of the journal, or check out our new website. And now for the part that you're actually here to discuss. Moderating the next panel is going to be Ms. Anna Gomez, a partner with the firm of Wiley Rhine. She has previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary at NTIA and spent 12 years at the Federal Communications Commission, including positions as Deputy Chief of the International Bureau and Senior Legal Advisor to then Chairman Kennard. Let's go ahead.
Thank you, Ethan. So first thing I wanted to note is that this weekend was the Federal Communications Bar Association moot court competition, and the University of Colorado team did very well. The team won first place, and Ethan won best oralist. And the other note that I got was that you are a super nice guy. So congratulations. And I also want to thank Phil, who I don't see is here, but for having yet another excellent conference and inviting me to moderate this panel at the last minute. And I really do enjoy, by the way, being able to meet the students and the questions of the students, so we will look forward to that part of the session. So this session is the Jurisprudence of Innovation. And what it's going to do is it's going to explore the institutional approaches and legal regimes that are most effective to enable innovation while still ensuring that agencies can meet their respective missions. I think it's a very timely session, and it's something we have been talking about really all weekend. But because we've seen a significant shift in regulatory philosophy in our current FCC, and we've also seen an uptick in very aggressive enforcement throughout the federal government. So we have some very good presenters. I would say they represent a diversity of viewpoints. And I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on the jurisprudence of innovation. We have 2 presenters today, Mark Cooper and Nathan Cortez. Dr. Mark Cooper is, of course, the the Director of Research at the Consumer Federation of America, where he has been for 25 years. He is very well known to a lot of us. And he has testified several hundred times. If you add up all his testimony before Congress, before the courts, before state and federal regulatory, have you done state regulatory agencies?
300.
Okay, state and federal regulatory agencies. And Nathan Cortez is our second presenter. He is Associate Dean for Research and Associate Professor of Law at Southern Methodist University School of Law. He specializes in health law, which will be a nice break from our telecom focus, administrative law and FDA law, but he also does research in how to regulate innovations and disrupt static regulatory regimes. We're then going to hear from 3 discussants, the first of which is Ray Gifford. Ray is a partner at Wilkinson Barker Knauer and is formerly served as president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation and as chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, so he will have a very interesting, diverse set of points of view. Randy Milch is the executive vice president and strategic policy advisor to Lowell McAdam at Verizon, where he oversees strategic policy initiatives. He formerly also served as the executive vice president for public policy and general counsel at Verizon. Of course, he had several other titles. I'm only giving a very brief overview of everyone's bio. And then finally, Howard Shalansky, also very well known here at Silicon Flatirons, is the administrator, the current administrator at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA as the rest of the world knows it. Previously, he was the director of the Bureau of Economics at the Federal Trade Commission, and before that, he was chief economist at the FCC. So I think he brings a lot of interesting perspectives about different types of regulatory regimes, especially since now he oversees almost all of them. Now, if that wasn't enough experience, I also just wanted to mention that he clerked for Justice Scalia and, most importantly, for Judge Williams, from whom we heard yesterday. And he wouldn't tell me anything that I could rat you out on during this panel, just so you know. So we're going to start with Mark. Mark will give us our first presentation.
Since I spend my day-to-day life in the trenches of regulatory proceedings and Washington policy and politics, I always use Silicon Flatirons to think big. And today I've done it even farther. Since I came at the end, what I will offer today is some observations on lots of the issues we heard about yesterday. So I get sort of the bat cleanup, and I rather like that. Pickering argued that we need to start from a shared set of principles to design a policy framework. I agree, and my paper offers a very comprehensive set of principles I call progressive, democratic, small d, capitalism. The framework is based on strong evidence that active policy helped to give rise to a virtuous cycle of innovation and investment in the economy by balancing public obligations and private interests. I also argue it has laid the groundwork for a virtuous cycle of justice in the polity. Because the political side typically lags during the maturation of capitalist technological revolutions, as Carlotta Perez shows, it's an author I think that people should become familiar with, the policy hurdle we face is to develop institutions that support a stable spiral from a gilded age in which we live to a golden age. And she argues the best way to secure the future is to understand the ingredients of the past. The virtuous cycle framework, adopted by the FCC, accepted by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which Jonathan Sallet cited yesterday, is strongly supported in the academic literature. It posits that innovation and investment at the edge stimulate demand for communications, innovation, and investment in the network, and increased capacity and functionality in the network creates more demand for innovation, and the cycle repeats and repeats. My analysis starts from and focuses on the important role that policy played in creating the environment for market success. And market success, creating market success, is much more important than preventing market failure. And there's a growing literature that recognizes that. This was the key point that Pickering, Scott Morton, and Kimmelman made yesterday. And Sallet pointed out that majority on the D.C. Circuit got it. They understood that market success, creating market success, is critical. Now, for me, the FCC's Carter phone computer inquiries and spread spectrum decisions, among others, reduced market imperfections, lowered barriers by adopting brutally simple, remarkably efficient rules that guaranteed access to essential communications resources, while it kept the FCC out of the day-to-day regulation of behavior. Shalansky is right in arguing that we need to worry about decisions that are too close to the margins. But if you draw simple, bright lines that are pro-competitive, don't dictate behaviors, I think you have a lot of room to succeed, which is what the FCC has done repeatedly over the past 30 years. Of course, broader policies helped. We all know about the Department of Defense involved in the protocol and other decisions. Many of the market barriers that Casey and David Clark talked about yesterday are on my list. And the point is that by significantly reducing but not eliminating those barriers, the FCC and other federal agencies helped to create an ecology of market success, and that increased the rate of innovation dramatically. The FCC also prevented market failure by by constraining the behavior of network operators at key points in the communications system. These incumbents have a willingness and ability to dampen experimentation at the edge. The simple fact of the matter is that, as Jeff Blautner put it yesterday, market power gained by skill, foresight, and industry can still pose a threat to the virtuous cycle. It's not only the abuse of market power that matters. I do worry about distinguishing between Schumpeterian rents, which should be encouraged, and Rockefeller rents, which should be discouraged, as Chris Yu points out. We clearly need to fund the infrastructure. But the problem is that left to their own devices, the network operators will tax and encumber the wrong things. And so we need policy to constrain their behaviors while we fund the development of infrastructure. Creating a space between the market and the state, free of the state overreach, free of the threat of distortion by the incumbents, created a space in which entrepreneurs flowed in. They immediately began to experiment, and the new entrants quickly adopted voluntary multi-stakeholder forms of governance, which reinforced the role of open protocols and stuck with the open protocols that reinforced the role of user-driven innovation. Those are things the incumbents never would have tolerated. And it was only the fact that this was an open space in which all the entrants were relatively equal. They did not have any market power. They agreed to cooperate. And that has become the success story of the Internet Protocol and Wi-Fi, the two greatest communications revolutions, I argue, in the history of the world. You heard a great deal about the multi-stakeholder approach and the importance of managing the transition, which I think is in good hands, but that's a side note. There are also other micro and macro level policies that devoted and contributed to this remarkable technological revolution. Now, for the normative part, I rely on Elizabeth Anderson's democratic egalitarianism as a theory of justice. She, like Carlota Perez, fully embraces the power and importance of capitalism. But she also has a rigorous non-Marxist critique of capitalism that strays from the progressive path. And I think that's the important distinction about understanding progressive capitalism. She argues that the pursuit of justice is pragmatic and aspirational. Casey used that word yesterday. David Clark worried about the precision of measurement, which is exactly what engineers are supposed to do. But we normal human beings and the social scientists, strong directionality is good enough. If we're headed in the right direction, we ought to be happy, because that's about all we ever get. Anderson adopts the Rawlsian concept, very important, that property is totally a social construct. She looks at history and demonstrates that under capitalism, property has been totally a social construct, and we have redefined it over the years. She adopts Rawls's first two principles. I won't belabor them. They're easy: basic liberties and fairness in access to positions. But she rejects the third Rawlsian principle of the difference principle, and for the lawyers in the crowd, they may or may not know what that means. It doesn't matter. She offers democratic egalitarianism to address two key questions. How much inequality should there be? And she argues a lot more than Rawls's difference principle will accept. And how should it be organized? She argues we need these inequalities to preserve the capitalist dynamic. But at the same time, we must strive for social relations of equality, with sufficiency at the bottom, security in the middle, and constraint at the top. This is language you're hearing in Washington these days. Here is a formal theory that's 20 years old. For me, however, the really important point, the claim of progressive capitalism rests on its remarkable success in improving the human condition. The capitalist industrial era, which represents roughly 2% of human history since the emergence of agricultural civilization, has witnessed 90% of the improvement in the material condition of humankind when measured by population, income per capita, heat, light, transportation, and communications. It has been the last 250 years. In fact, after 10,750 years plus of persistent grinding poverty, progressive capitalism has demonstrated the ability to grow surplus and distribute it widely enough to radically change the view of the future, creating the expectation of continuous substantial material progress. That is what we now believe. We did not believe that 250 years ago. And that view of progress changes the fundamental concept of justice. And I think that is a critical point. Ambassador Kornblum made the point yesterday. The nations around the world, they just want to make sure they are included in the spiral of success. That's what the tension is about. I argue that the universal service goals of the 34 Act are in fact an example of pragmatic progressive capitalism. The 96 Act expanded that by including advanced telecom and information services in an evolutionary view of communications. Congress enacted broadband acts in 08 and 09 that extended the view to include adoption, not just availability, recognizing that adoption is the critical link that ties the virtuous cycle to economic, social, and political progress. All of these changes are part of a 250-year evolution towards inclusiveness in the communication space. This is, in fact, progress. Indeed, communications progress under the digital mode of production is unprecedented. We have 5 billion people with cell phones and 4 billion people on the internet. Measured by the ability to reach others, to access information, 90% of progress in human history has not taken place in the last 250 years. It's taken place in the last 25 years. This is a revolution that is unprecedented. The digital revolution, as you heard yesterday, is also an American revolution, and I went out to prove that. I looked at the Forbes 2000, which account for 44% of the total global GDP. Those corporations matter. You look at every digital sector, the U.S. has 80%, measured by profits, employment, revenues. We totally dominate this revolution, unlike any other previous capitalist revolution. The dominance is greater and it's persisted longer. Ambassador Kornblum yesterday mentioned the French disease when it comes to the digital revolution. In fact, France has contributed almost nothing to the digital revolution. In fact, if you look back over 250 years, France contributed nothing to the Industrial Revolution, except they had the good sense to lose the 100-Year War to the British and then help the Americans break free. So we are the greatest contribution of the French. The challenge we face today is absolutely not that we're falling behind on broadband. The challenge we face today is we haven't figured out how to quickly spread the progressive revolution to the rest of the world. It's called catch-up. And we really need to make sure that everybody else catches up. This is the central issue that Ambassadors Gibbs and Kornblum mentioned yesterday. It was noted that the edge companies in the U.S. are actively seeking to get the last 3 billion people on the internet. This is wonderful. It's also interesting that they want to do so by occupying a commons, using a shared public resource, and relying on an open protocol for the purpose of avoiding having to deal with dominant communications incumbents. This should give us great hope for the future of capitalism. We have not yet run out of that cycle. That some may make a little money in the process, or even a lot, is not an insult. It is the quid pro quo for progress. As long as they are bound by social obligations, pay a reasonable tax rate, support universal service, and accept strong consumer protection. That's the challenge of institutionalizing the progressive digital revolution. And it's a very urgent challenge. The ability of capitalism to produce surplus is undoubted. The ability to institute a progressive regime is much more doubtful and harder. We have to work very hard at that. And the responsibility falls on the leading core capitalist nation. That's our job, and we have to shoulder it. If the arc of history bends towards justice, as Martin Luther King observed, today it points to a political philosophy and an institutional paradigm that can build a progressive capitalist system to deliver economic progress and political participation all the way down and across the global division of labor. The system needs to be capitalist so it can produce surplus. And it needs to be progressive with a small p to stabilize expansion and secure popular support if we intend to have the revolution reach its full potential. Thank you.
It's very good to know that you are not a socialist, as has been accused, instead a capitalist, and a progressive one at that. Nathan.
Great. That was a wonderful, interesting talk. I don't know if I can really follow that up. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've always greatly admired the programming here at Silicon Flatirons, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it. And I'm particularly pleased to share a panel with my fellow co-panelists and discussants. I look forward to our exchange. So my perspective on innovation policy may differ a little from what you've heard. I've spent my career not focused on internet regulation or information technologies, but on the medical industry. So my prescriptions on innovation policy are informed much more by Food and Drug Law and FDA considerations than by telecommunications law. But I've spent the last few years studying a class of technologies that merges these two disciplines, and that's what introduced me to the telecom scholarship and the wonderful scholars and discussions here at Colorado. So I've been researching mobile health technologies, the use of smartphones, wireless devices, tablets for health or medical purposes, including diagnosis, treatment advice, et cetera, et cetera. So I've been interested in joining the discussion on innovation policy, particularly for so-called disruptive technologies that might fall within a regulator's jurisdiction, but don't square well with that agency's regulatory framework. So I'm not focused on the disruptive innovation that Clayton Christensen talks about. I'm focused on what I call regulatory disruption. So again, a technology that may fall within a regulator's jurisdiction, but which kind of outstrips the agency's ability to deal effectively with it, given the agency's statutory jurisdiction and given the framework they've developed to deal with older products. There are all kinds of interesting historical examples. There are fascinating contemporary examples, FCC regulation of the internet, local regulation of Uber and Airbnb, USD regulation of genetically modified organisms, and I've focused on FDA regulation of software. So how should regulators approach these novelties? So my research jumped into the innovation scholarship. How do we encourage innovation? How do we regulate innovation? And I wrote an article trying to rebut the conventional wisdom that regulators should necessarily prioritize caution and flexibility and deference, exceeding deference to industry when dealing with novel products or technologies. And because I've studied in depth how this failed. I looked at the past 30, 40 years of FDA regulation of computer hardware and software devices, and I found that the FDA took an exceedingly deferential approach and a cautious posture towards medical software 30 years ago, and now it has a framework that just isn't capable of dealing with the computer revolution in medicine. Had the FDA dedicated more resources and taken a more thoughtful but a robust approach early on, I think we'd have even more useful products today, and we probably would have avoided a lot of the deaths and suffering caused by failures in computer hardware and software when used in medical devices. However, my major point here is that it's hard to create universal truths for all products and all regulators. The FDA regulates things like drugs and devices, which if they don't work or they're unsafe can cause death and serious harm. Obviously, the lessons for FDA regulation don't necessarily apply to FCC regulation of broadband providers and the like, and vice versa. So my first point is that any jurisprudence of innovation really has to account for the unique nature of the market and the unique nature of the agency. Some agencies are very different from others. So again, wisdom that applies to FCC regulation might not necessarily apply to FDA regulation and vice versa. But the challenge of disruptive innovation is becoming more acute and more common given the revolution in information technologies. So you might have seen this article published last month in the Sunday Times Book Review, Among the Disruptive. And the author says, quote, "Aside from issues of life and death, there is no more urgent task for American intellectuals and writers than to think critically about the salience of technology in individual and collective life." What's interesting to me is that given the research I'm doing, discussions of life and death do intersect with discussions of communications technology. So with some of these medical programs, as computer hardware and software programs, we're seeing software algorithms dictate how radiation beams are shaped at cancerous tissue but spare healthy tissue around it. We're seeing computer programs and algorithms used to detect rare genetic abnormalities and the like. So the information technology revolution and the wireless revolution is spreading into other fields. Another quote that struck me, it says, "Every technology is used before it is completely understood." Well, what does that, I think most of us would probably agree on that. So what does that mean for regulatory agencies? So my research argues that, at least with certain products in certain industries, early decisive regulation can actually be appropriate and can actually help the industry long term. So I want you to consider the mobile health industry. There really wasn't a mobile health industry 10 years ago. After Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, the market started producing health apps and mobile medical technologies at a crazy pace. And in March 2013, this report estimated that there were over 97,000 different mobile health apps on the market. And the same report went on to say that 1.7 billion smartphone users would have mobile health apps on their phones by 2018. So that's a remarkable amount of innovation in the last 7-8 years. And not all of these products fall within FDA jurisdiction. So there has to be well over 100,000 mobile health apps on the market today. If even 10% of those fall within FDA jurisdiction, that's 10,000 new products within a single regulator's jurisdiction introduced in less than a decade. This is an industry that didn't even exist a decade ago. So this is a real problem for regulators. What I see as the problem in the market, in the mobile health market, is that there's very low consumer confidence in many of these products, and the market's being undermined by products with no scientific or medical merit. So this is just one of many examples. The Federal Trade Commission brought an enforcement action against 2 iPhone apps that purported to treat acne. And they instructed users to hold your smartphone close to your face and turn the app on, and it would alternate flashing colored lights, red and blue. And they sold several thousand of these. They weren't expensive, $1.99, $3.99, sometimes 99 cents. But these were absolutely scientifically meritless products. There's no medical theory. There's absolutely no medical support for these things working. And so there are lots of meritless products in the marketplace that just have the independent medical reviews show have no scientific or medical basis. There's no possible way something like this would actually work. So the medical literature is finding a lot of these products to be deeply problematic. And I trace this in my scholarship back to the FDA's very earliest consideration of hardware and software in medical devices 30, 40 years ago. So what I argue that weak oversight actually undermines the legitimate products in the market. And the major challenge I see in the mobile health industry isn't the lack of innovation. It's not a quantity issue, it's a quality issue. We have very low quality innovation. And so my thinking on this has been influenced by Dan Carpenter at Harvard, who's written pretty eloquently on market constituting regulation. So how can an agency like the FDA provide some early regulation that can actually help constitute markets and incentivize companies to engage in high quality innovation? Someone yesterday said that they would like to see internet service providers and the like compete on investment. So how do we encourage high quality innovation while discouraging the kind of low quality innovation that will create hundreds of products that have no scientific or medical basis at all? So Carpenter's classic example is pharmaceuticals. So without the FDA's veto power over new drugs entering the market, what we had in around 1900, before the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, we had a massive market for patent medicines. There were 50,000 different patent medicines on the market, and they were rubbish. They didn't do anything. The only product from that era that was redeemed over time was aspirin. So people are taking thousands and thousands of products, patent medicines, snake oil, and the like, that didn't work. Now, we actually have an analog for this today. It's the modern dietary supplement industry. So today there are 65,000 different dietary supplements on the market, and this book on the left by Paul Offit at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School surveyed 51,000 of these products, and he found that only 4 of them have a legitimate scientific basis. For example, taking a product, folic acid, if you're pregnant, can reduce the risk of neural tube defects, things like that. So Carpenter writes about low-value innovation. What we have in the dietary supplement industry is a lot of low-value innovation. We have people just cobbling together products that don't have any scientific basis or merit, and we don't have any high-value innovation. So the modern dietary supplement industry, which was deregulated by Congress in 1994 legislation, looks very much like the patent medicines market did at the turn of the century before we had an agency like the FDA. So what I argue is that for some markets, encouraging innovation should be the primary policy goal, and we should really prioritize policies that reduce regulatory barriers to entry. But for other markets, decisive regulation can actually help constitute that market and encourage high-value innovation. So not all markets are created equally, and I go on to my research to talk about several wonky administrative law principles, but I think that regulators for certain markets can be more decisive, and they can actually help a well-functioning market. We don't want the mobile health industry to turn into the dietary supplement industry. I think that's a worst-case scenario. And I've talked to doctors and physicians and medical entrepreneurs who say that legitimate products are just being flooded by the illegitimate ones. So the risk is that the illegitimate products, the ones with no scientific or medical merit, will inundate consumers and undermine the market as a whole, and there's no good way for consumers to differentiate ex ante which products work and which ones don't. So this is a very different take. I know this is not telecom law, and the principles I announced may have nothing to do with what you guys are considering, but I do think when we're talking about innovation policy, particularly as telecommunications and wireless starts bleeding into other sectors, we need to be careful about enunciating universal principles about innovation policy, because it very much does depend on the market. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan and Mark. We do appreciate your presentations. I'm going to now turn it over to Ray, who will give us our first discussant response.
Sure. And I'll probably talk mostly about Mark's presentation, but I think I have some comments that would touch on what Nathan was saying too. Having been substituted onto this panel Friday, I make the disclaimer that these are tentative and maybe not fully baked comments. Aiming at Mark's paper and discussion, it kind of reminded me of Leibniz's theodicy, which is that we must live in the best of all possible worlds because God has created this world and God only would create the best of all possible worlds. Mark's argument, I think, is something like that, which is progressive democratic capitalism has given us innovation, and therefore progressive democratic capitalism gives us the best of all possible worlds for innovation policy. I just, maybe, but maybe not. In thinking about the title of this panel, what a jurisprudence of innovation might look like, I'm not sure that I would build it up the same way that Mark has. I suppose I'd come at it from a more traditional view and perspective, which is what are the traits of a jurisprudence, and extending that jurisprudence beyond just how the way courts would look at something, but into the way an administrative agency would look at it. And I think we've talked about a lot of these aspects for, going on 15 years now. And that the jurisprudence of innovation, I think first and foremost, might not self-consciously be going after innovation as its end. And in fact, because the vector and direction of innovation are probably something you, in your jurisprudential mode, don't have the greatest perspective on. So let me cite 5 traits that may or may not appear in progressive democratic capitalism that I do think make for a jurisprudence of innovation possible. First and foremost, modesty. We have spoken again of what problems regulators have, of what problems companies have. Right, you have information asymmetry problems. We're talked about a great deal yesterday. There's the knowledge problem in the classic Hayekian sense that there are monopoly problems that we know show up, and the perennial principal agent problem. These are kind of the oldies but goodies that plague regulation, that plague jurisprudence here, there, and everywhere, be it telecom, broadband, energy, or the environment. So you have to proceed with modesty and some fear and trembling at those facts on the ground. I think you can also, by the same token, recognize that there are some things you do know. In these network industries that we deal with day in and day out, there are characteristics that are common, there are characteristics that are different, but there are enormous returns to scale in most cases. There is an imperative, given the high fixed cost nature of these networks, that price discrimination is going to be rampant, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And you've got some temptations that take place as well, which is that you get the other party to sink his or her capital, and then there's the regulatory temptation to confiscate it. And if you go into your jurisprudence of modesty, not a jurisprudence of innovation, I think you approach the questions with a degree of fear and trembling and a degree of trepidation, not that you don't have to do things at certain instances, but you have to realize in many cases how little you know and how little you can affect, which was one point in Mark's paper that I did tend to agree with. I think the baseline lesson there is, as a regulator, If you find yourself in the position of price setting or compelling transactions, you should be very nervous. Now, that's not to say that you never have to do it, but you may have, as a first instinct, the desire to look for institutions that get you out of that business. And we talked a lot about that on the interconnection panel yesterday. That is not to say, again, that you never do it, but given the knowledge problem, you know that when you get yourself into the business of price setting, you're probably going to be a victim more of political economy pressures than knowing what the right answer is. The second principle that I'd put forward after modesty is clarity or predictability. Create rules that allow private bargains to take place, right? Create institutions that allow private ordering to make things happen. We have talked and will talk with some no small bit of vanity here at Silicon Flatirons about BTAG and what that institutionally is trying to do, the Broadband Internet Technical Advisory Group. It is trying to create clarity and trying to create a place where transactions and intermediation can occur without possibly government action. The third principle I would point to for a jurisprudence of innovation is uniformity. Now, uniformity doesn't mean that everything must be the same or that a broad non-discrimination principle has to apply anywhere and everywhere. In fact, as Chris Yu pointed out yesterday, open access regimes sometimes are desirable, sometimes are not desirable. And in fact, we have plenty of examples, and this is where I would disagree pretty firmly with Mark and call his story a little bit too just so, is open access has been necessary and desirable in some instances. It has been a catastrophic failure in others. If you look beyond even our little corner of the world, you look at how ICC attempts to ban price discrimination and enforce uniformity in the railroad industry led them to not just the brink of disaster, but to disaster. If you look at how the open access orders of the FERC in the late 1990s caused investment in long-distance transmission lines to plummet, you'll see where open access regimes can fall flat on their face because you miss that first aspect of the how do you get the capital to show up and invest in these long-lived assets, and no one's going to show up if the confiscation risk is too high. Two final principles is subsidiarity. Where is the level of government and jurisprudence right? We have, I think, largely rightly devolved most communications and broadband regulation to the federal level. We have, in the converse, left most energy and electric and natural gas regulation at the state level. I think that's not a bad first cut. But I do think we also have some mistakes. For instance, the Natural Gas Policy Act allowed you to cite a natural gas line fairly easily and eliminated state barriers. So if you want to build a gas line, you can do it. The Federal Power Act does not allow that to happen with transmission, which means it's a state-by-state, county-by-county, city-by-city process. And if you want to know why people will invest in natural gas lines but not in transmission lines, all things being equal, there's a failure of the subsidiarity question. And having argued for things like federal siting authority for transmission for over a decade, there's incremental progress, but not great. But that principle of subsidiarity, I think, matters. I think it matters to the communications world as well. There are things that even we parochial, benighted, captured state regulators do better than the feds. And the final process that is integrity. How do you get a jurisprudential process that avoids things like Judge Williams was talking about yesterday, capture, taxation by regulation, which I think Mark indicates in his presentation he's pretty fond of, that this is Posner's theory that regulation is not necessarily about regulatory capture, but rather it's about regulatory taxation by regulation. It's much easier to implicitly and explicitly create subsidies through a monopoly regulatory process than it would be to get taxes and transfer payments through a Congress. And I think you have to be very careful of treating, as a final point, giving special favors to certain industries. And that probably gets back to the uniformity, the integrity. But once you grant infant industry status to a given industry, we find as a general matter, it never goes away. The production tax credit for wind dates from 1992. The universal service system, as we all know, is now morphing into a broadband universal service system. It may or may not be a good thing that that's happening. Probably generally on the margin it's good, but you need to be careful as you head into that. And with that, I'll shut up and let Randy move on.
Thanks, Ray. I admired your own taxonomy, and I was trying to think myself of, as I faced the jurisprudence of innovation, how high-minded that was. For those of us in the trenches, and Mark's been in the trenches for years, and there have been others of us in the trenches, a high-minded approach to it somehow seems to leave you unimpressed, because it's not a high-minded game. It's a take the hill toward it. I think that there are a few aspects of reality that need to be imposed on the concept, an academic concept of how you're going to decide to regulate. The first, I think, is just the actuality of the agencies themselves. By the way, full of very devoted people who work very hard, and I have nothing but gratitude for the folks who make the decision to go do that, because it's got to be done. And I've always tried to treat them as honored opponents or honored co-effort, people with co-effort in trying to get things done. But let's face it, you have regulatory agencies that are essentially rulemaker, prosecutor, judge, and jury on the one hand. And on the other hand, they entertain more discretionary roles. Merger reviews, transaction reviews, license giving. So with very loose standards in reality about how those are supposed to be effectuated. And I would posit that particularly in the current situation where counting coup on the enforcement side has become very, very important in this administration, that it raises the specter of somewhat of a conflict of interest to have the same judge, jury, prosecutor also be the person making licensure and other decisions, and any set of decisions that have very loose guidelines, I think raises that prospect where you have very significant sets of issues in front of administrative agencies. You also face the issue of multiple regulators. I thought it was very interesting that the example that Nathan put up about the bogus acne apps was an FTC enforcement proceeding, basically over fraudulent advertising or unjust and unreasonable product. It wasn't an FDA proceeding. There was nothing about the FDA about that. It was an FTC proceeding, and I think that raises the same aspect. We've had the discussion here earlier this morning about the overlapping or non-overlapping jurisdictions of the FCC and the FTC. We've had discussions already about what it means to have multiple agencies supervising the same conduct or potentially supervising the same conduct. by the way, there is a flip side to that, and that is, I think it was raised yesterday, the prospect that there are very significant players in the internet ecosystem who currently are not under don't seem to be under anyone's jurisdiction, and query whether whether going down a 706 path means that there will be more players subject to jurisdiction versus going down a Title II path, which seems to limit jurisdictions to only a few players in the internet ecosystem. So I think that there's very significant questions as you proceed down a theory of regulating that impinges on innovation to realize that there are either multiple regulators or instances where there seems to be no extant regulator over a principal player in an ecosystem. And I think that these practical lessons, these practicalities, of regulation need to be understood and be part of any approach, any theoretical approach to the effect of regulation on innovation. I think that much of the debate today, or actually I should probably say the debate over the last few years. I think the debate today about net neutrality is a vastly different debate, but the debate over the last few years about net neutrality was very well characterized by much more light than heat, much more heat than light, and there's very little understanding of the complexities of network, where innovation actually originated in the ecosystem, and the like. I also think that we have some very abject lessons about the perils of overregulation in this space. We have the lesson that arose in the regime of the unbundling rules after the '96 Act, and I don't think it's any accident that the massive investment that occurred after those unbundling rules were retracted. And I think that the lesson that's going on in Europe, when the French disease was mentioned, I always think of the French disease as being the overregulation in Europe of broadband networks, and the realization that the Europeans have made themselves that they have overregulated broadband networks, and investment has suffered. So I don't think that these are abstract dangers associated with overregulation in this space. I think those of us who have been in this long enough remember the decisions being made, investments decisions being made at certain levels and at certain times, depending on the regulatory framework. And I think you're going to see investment decisions made again based upon the regulatory framework, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I will go off with one note about Verizon's own interaction with the FDA over a mobile health app. Ended with us withdrawing the entire effort because the regulatory burdens were just simply too high to get a very simple mobile health app through the regime. And by the time we were looking at success, the market had moved on, and it was no longer prudent for us to make the investment in the app. And I just think that this was a very simple app, and I think that it's just interesting that these have real-world effects for folks trying to innovate. Howard.
Howard, I think it falls to you to defend the honor of France.
Well, I do like that I get tons of TV channels, unlimited telephone, and pretty high-speed broadband, €40 a month. There we go. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. There are some short-term consumer price benefits, I will say that. But as for the longer-run issues, I'll defer to the comments already made. I want to make some brief comments following on the really excellent comments that have already been made about both Mark's and Nathan's paper. And I think that when you think about the idea of a progressive capitalism as a framework in which to think about regulation going forward, if that is going to mean anything, it is going to mean that the adjective progressive informs our choices about what values to emphasize or what path to take when a given decision emerges about which right should dominate during a period of conflicts of rights. So for example, if we were going to talk about whether an edge application or a core investor is going to emerge victorious from a particular conflict over the rights to do a certain thing, what work does the term progressive do in Marx's progressive capitalism? Well, what it must do is the work of hearkening back to a certain set of traditions, a certain set of values and decisions made in the past that will tell us, in an area of uncertainty, in an area of future prediction, where do you want to place your bet? And I think it's important to recognize that, I was beginning to think that we were seeing just a remarkable event here, which was, Mark Cooper coming out as an evangelical capitalist. But I actually am not convinced that that's true, and I think that there's. I was beginning to think that we were left with only Alaska and Norway as bastions of socialism, and I think that what we're learning, I think that the truth is that buried in what Mark is talking about is an appreciation for the work that capitalism does, and a genuine one when he looks at the growth, and an appreciation for the fact that capitalism should be an inframarginal force. But what happens when you have to make the marginal decision in a conflict of rights? And I think that the work that the term progressive is doing in Marx's framework is to anchor that in something other than marginal economic values that one would try to choose at the moment. Now, I think there's a principled argument for that, which is we can't know what those marginal economic values are. But this is where I think Ray's point is an incredibly profound one. You could look at institutions designed to help mediate these decisions as institutions that do one of two things. They could be institutions that make the choice about whose rights win out on perhaps a progressive basis or a public interest basis, or the institution can try to facilitate private transactions because market transactions, while not always perfect and often clouded by externalities and transaction costs, typically, and I want to be very clear, typically not always do a better job of telling us what the correct sort of marginal valuation from a social welfare standpoint is in a given transaction. So I have a little bit of a difference of opinion from Mark, and I guess my question that I would ask Mark to address later when he addresses things is, where is the learning of, for example, Ronald Coase in this framework? Coase tells us we need to be very careful about how we frame rights debates. We tend to frame them as somebody interfering with somebody else's rights. But really what we're asking in almost any case where we're talking about, for example, an ISP's interference with an edge technology's unimpeded flow to an end user, or to put it differently, an end user's ability to prioritize through the price system particular edge applications. What we're really asking about is whose rights win out. And what Coase taught us to do is to be very careful about assuming one right to be systematically the better and more valuable one. For example, assuming a doctor's provision of medical care to be more socially valuable on the margin than a confectioner's production of confections, and instead try to see if there was a market transaction that would elucidate what the relative marginal values are. So I worry that what Mark really means by progressive capitalism is some kind of framework that would say we don't need to do that marginal valuation even if we can. In fact, we don't even need to facilitate the private market transactions on the margin that would give us those relative values. We rather have a system of received learning over the decades, over the centuries, that would tell us over time what really is the best progressive choice to make, what's the best way to place a bet, divorced from those marginal economic assessments. And that to me is something that warrants some serious thought and discussion. Let me shift a little bit to Nathan's paper. So I really like the work you're doing, Nathan. I think it is important. There is a tendency to fetishize the word innovation and to jump back from competition enforcement to jump back from regulation just because somebody has mentioned innovation. And I think it's important to think seriously about where different regulatory approaches actually help and actually hurt. And so I thought I found two really interesting ideas in your paper. One is that light touch threat-based regulation can in fact over time be more harmful to innovation than a more focused, direct, and at least superficially more intrusive regulatory approach. I think that's an interesting idea, and I think in your paper you've developed that very well in a particular FDA example. I do think, however, that there are counterexamples, and so one question I would have for you is, how much is the problem a light touch threat-based regulation, and how much is the problem a failure to follow up on that as learning is provided? So in Tim Wu's paper on regulatory threats, he talks about broadband as an example of a successful threat-based regulation where we have Bill Kennard's, famous no-opoly of 1999, followed by Michael Powell's Four Freedoms. And eventually, as we learned more, we're now going to be in a new world of Chairman Wheeler's Title II regulation, but the action is not in declaring this to be, declaring broadband to be under Title II. That is a jurisdictional move. All the action is now, and boy, you private sector telecom lawyers ought to be very psyched about this, as should you students, because man, there's going to be a lot of fascinating work in figuring out where that forbearance gets exercised, what a particular forbearance decision means in particular applications. It's going to be an exciting and interesting world for telecom practice and analysis, rivaled only by what Judge Green did for the telecom bar with the MFJ. So we're entering some exciting times here. But I want to get back to regulation and innovation. I think there are three main ways that innovation and regulation interact, and it's important to know which one we're talking about. Nathan's talking about something very particular, which is how regulation should apply to a new phenomenon. And I think that is a very important kind of problem, and I think we need to ask, are there risks we want to stay ahead of? And how do we stay ahead of the risks that something might create without choking off the underlying innovation itself? And here I have a little bit of concern with I think your point is a very good one, that we shouldn't reflexively and always be afraid of a serious and specific regulation and always resort to generalized threats. On the other hand, I didn't find your example of supplements persuasive. And here's why. First of all, I think that through a lot of junk innovation, elements of good innovations can emerge. And I think it's very, very dangerous to early on start messing with within an innovative ecosystem and to say, well, all this stuff is low value. Well, there's a lot of low value stuff that goes out there. There are a lot of patents. Mark Lemley's work is really good on this. Most patents are worth nothing. But when you look at the patents that are valuable, you tend to find that they are often pulling up elements of things that have been done and that in and of themselves were worthless. Second of all, if there is no harm happening, which is not totally the case with a lot of these supplements, but at least is widely the case. We do have the FTC with a generalized jurisdiction that can go after this for false advertising, and we have a tort system, a pretty well-functioning tort system. Now, I understand there are problems in getting your hands on some of these supplement makers, and the final thing is, so I worry a little bit about declaring an area to be low value, and using regulation to set a high benchmark for what qualifies as innovation. And so I wonder if we can't instead generalize what the FDA does. There is a path for those people who want to have their regulations deemed high value, or their innovations deemed high value. Go through and get approval. It's difficult, it's burdensome, it's costly, but by the time you're through that, you're branded as scientifically meritorious, FDA approved, and you're not heaved down there with the range of sort of phony and bizarre supplements. So there is an alternative path there. And so I guess I'm attracted to the idea of where there's not much risk of harm, regulatory-free zone, perhaps some good elements will come out of it, and preserve the path for those people who want to be able to grab the label of approved. And so I wonder how that fits in with your thinking. Let me just say that, conclude by saying talking about two other interactions of regulation and innovation. I do think another very important thing that regulators need to think about is innovation that unsettles regulatory assumptions. So regulation must always be examining itself and examining the marketplace for things that are coming in that change the underlying assumptions of existing regulation. Certainly wireless did that to a lot of landline regulation. I think there are a lot of examples where that comes into place. And I think it's an interesting question that really bears on the conversation that John Sallet and Fiona Scott Morton had yesterday about where regulation should dominate more kind of ex post competition intervention in the case of monopoly. When is the disruption or unsettling of an innovation sufficient enough that we start to dial back innovation? So I think that's one of the big innovation regulation dynamics that we have to always be thinking about. And the final thing that I think regulation needs to think about is how do we regulate and preserve not a particular innovation, but the process of innovation going forward. How do we preserve incentives for people to reduce the costs of regulatory compliance, to reduce the risks, particularly in the health and safety regulation area, of the thing being regulated? And how do we give people a reward for exceeding performance standards in a regulation? How does regulation avoid locking in a particular standard, making it pointless for somebody to do an innovation that does better? This is the other big challenge for regulation going forward, preserving those incentives. And I think that ties to some of your comments and some of your paper, Nathan. How do we know when a light touch is going to be harmful, but when it might be the best way of preserving those incentives going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it would also be very interesting to think about when does a threat result in self-regulation such that you actually don't need to even worry about a light touch regulation. And I think that there are plenty of examples in the history of telecom, for sure, but that is something that we seem to be backing away from. I want to be able to give lots of time for the students in the audience to ask questions. So I want to give everybody 1 minute. 1 minute to respond to anything you want to respond to from what you've heard. And I think that I will start with Randy and then end with Howard. So we'll go.
And I'll waive my time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll waive my time too. I will take it after Mark speaks. Maybe that's the.
Maybe I should have started with Mark, but okay. Ray, is there anything you...
I'm waiting for Mark, too.
All right, look, Mark, why don't we just start with Mark?
Well, I'll just take your 4 minutes here. So, you know, I
already have.
If you ask people around, a lot of people on the left actually recognize I am a devout capitalist. I mean, I have advocated that. So, but the interesting question, so the answer to Howard is hard cases make bad law. Stay off the margins. That's what you really want to do. The best you can is you don't want to have to make too many of those marginal decisions. You want to be inframarginal. But if you have to make these decisions, and that's the point of Anderson's argument that property is socially constructed. Economic value is socially constructed. There's no notion that it's purely independent. So the rule that I would argue, Carterphone is exactly one of Nathan's examples. Carterphone was this magnificently little simple decision that flipped the obligation, right? We had, thou shalt not connect anything to my network until I approve it. And the FCC said, no, let's do it the other way. Freedom first. Innovation first. Connect whatever you want and let the dominant firm prove it's harming the network. So you shifted the burden of proof, and lo and behold, AT&T could never prove the harm. And we got the Hayes modem. I mean, it's a really good example. So your response to the question of if I have to decide at the margin, you want the most freedom for the largest number of entrepreneurs to experiment. And I think that was true with Wi-Fi. It took a resource and said, anybody can have it. And it creates a freedom to experiment. I think that is humble. I think that is modest. It says, let the entrepreneurs do their thing. But there will be constraints. There have to be constraints. It will always come up, and there will be hard decisions. But my measure, my directionality will be, am I incenting more people to do more things? Which clearly the ICC, the first thing I ever worked on was the railroads. They were nuts. They said, they were presented with the prospect of putting flat cars on trailers on flat cars. Simplest thing, let you put you haul it across the country on the train, and then you take it off and you deliver it with the cab. And they said, that mixes trucks and trains. They said, we can't let that happen. They denied the freedom to do stuff. So I think that's a rule, because I don't disagree with you. I've heard your principles before, and I don't think I sort of systematically violate them unless I really have to.
All right, does anybody want to get a word in against Mark now?
I'm totally persuaded. I don't know.
Okay, well, just one question then. So, Nathan, in your paper, you talk about regulatory experimentation, and I think regulatory innovations as well. And the idea is, are there alternative mechanisms than our tried and true regulatory mechanisms of rulemaking, enforcement, and threats? And one of those, to me, is the multi-stakeholder process that we talked about yesterday and today, where we talked about industry and, stakeholders, multi-stakeholder driven standard codes of conduct that are voluntarily adopted and therefore enforceable. Under what circumstances does that work, and under what circumstances does that not work?
I think that's a great question. I teach administrative law, and I talk about the long evolution of administrative regulation. And, agencies used to rely primarily on enforcement actions, adjudication, and then rulemaking became the vogue. In the last 20 years, we're really firmly in an era of cooperative governance, of creative collaboration between industry and regulators. There's still traditional enforcement actions. There's still the lengthy 2-year rulemaking cycles that agencies have to do. But, speaking to Howard's comments, I think agencies have to, I think there's a tremendous dialogue now between agencies and industry, and this conference is a perfect example. And going through the public hearings and the dialogue between the mobile health industry and FDA, FCC, and the FTC, I've seen just a tremendous outreach. The FDA is bent over backwards to make its regulatory system, to explain how it works and to make exceptions. And it's really, in my opinion, is really trying to help the industry. And there's a lot of solicitude for the industry, and I think it's appropriate. I also think there's a time to bring enforcement actions, because if something is systematically under-enforced, then all those standards and pronunciations by agencies are meaningless. And with dietary supplements, both FDA and FTC can bring enforcement actions, but there's such little enforcement against the supplement industry that you see this equilibrium where products can get away with making ridiculous claims. And I have students in my food and drug law class, and I talk about the law, and they say, what about this? They bring in ads, and they send me links, and I'm like, well, this is not an active area of enforcement. So it very much depends on the relationship between the regulator and the regulated. I do think we're in an era of tremendous innovation and cooperation between industry and government, and I think that's a good thing. And I think there is a lot of regulatory experimentation, and the traditional adversarial relationship is a lot more complicated. Mm-hmm. I was talking to Randy earlier, you're a repeat player in front of agencies, and I think that creates a different dynamic than if you have a one-off transaction. And FDA companies regulated by the FDA know that their application to the agency is not the last time they're going to see them.
Do you think that's salutary or negative?
It depends. I think it can be either. And in practice, I saw companies who had very good working relationships with the FDA, and as attorneys liaising between the two, our job was very easy. And we got a lot more leeway in enforcement actions. I also had companies as clients who were known to be recalcitrant, and it made our job very difficult. The question on innovation, tremendous innovation in the biotech industry, tremendous innovation in the mobile health industry, and I think that's happening not necessarily because of regulation. I think it's happening on its own regardless. Some of this innovation is going to happen regardless. Now, if something gets to market and you want to make claims about it, does it work? I think there should be, and if it's a health and safety issue going to the risk, I think there should be room for errors and experimentation with lots of technologies, because if they don't work or they aren't any good, the market's going to tell you, and that product won't be offered for very long. If it's a health and safety product, if I have a diabetes monitoring app and it's misreading my calculations and telling me to give insulin doses when I don't need them, or telling me not to give insulin, up my insulin dose when I do need it, that's problematic. I think that's qualitatively different.
We vigorously support the notion of multi-stakeholderism. CFA participates in reg negs all the time in the environmental space. I advocated for that other space, and I believe that that is the evolution. We need to evolve to relying on multi-stakeholderism, well organized, so that it's actually open and fair for our dynamic industries. Because these industries, the problem in telecom is simple. Law is static, technology is dynamic. And if we keep saying, let's get the legislators to do it, they'll be wrong every time because it evolves too fast. We need to develop that kind of institution where the parties are invested in the process, accept the process, so that both sides know more quickly, before the big mistakes are made, before we get to the margin, what's going to work, what's going to trigger complaints, and certainly in the environment, it has proven to be very, very successful.
But isn't the mistake we made, and Phil talked about this a little bit yesterday, that we passed the Telecom Act at exactly the wrong time, right? We passed it 2 years before the internet, or a few years. One of the problems, though, is how laws are going to be formed, which is based on specific vested interests at the time. Don't you need to change the prism of how you make law such that what you're putting forward are general principles that are supple enough to handle innovation into the future, and so you don't have these technological anomalies, as we do in the Telecom Act, that are aimed in the wrong direction?
You could argue that the Telecom Act was written at exactly the right time, and it was so plastic it could have ended up in a completely different place. It was a set of legal decisions that took place. There was language in there about preserving the internet as it was in 1996. It was a certain way. It's not that way today. So the language was there to make what we would have made of it. It's the lawyers subsequent to that. But the answer is that the better we build the system of multi-stakeholder collaboration, the less law we'll need. And we want law to be really simple, and regulation to be really simple, because the more you ask the regulator to decide whether you can put the trailer on the flat car, the worse off you're going to be.
See, it's interesting because there is such robust multi-stakeholderism already in the internet space, and the BTAG extending through many of the questions many of the access questions, which I think are again largely theoretical, and yet there was no confidence in those. There was no confidence in those multi-stakeholder systems in order to as an alternative to increased regulation in the space. So I find it interesting that you're in favor of them. But I also find it interesting that, as a general matter, those pushing for more regulation were not confident in those bodies, which, to my mind, have worked very well. I mean, they're distinguished people on them. They reached decisions, and things moved along very well. I do have one other comment on the threat aspect of it, which I think is interesting. I think it'd be. There's been a lot of talk about capture, which is obviously a significant issue. Although I think that it is misunderstood in some respects. Certainly, your example of your non-recalcitrant clients getting a worse shake than your compliant, replete player clients raises significant issues for me as someone who represented a regulated industry. I also think that the threat concept occupies a space at the very limit of, usually at the limit of the regulator's jurisdiction. And that's why it's employed. There's some efficiency aspects, don't get me wrong. I understand those efficiency aspects, and there have been times when a regulator has said, you guys fix this or I will. And that's a more efficient way of getting things done as a general matter. I understand that. But I also think, for instance, the 4 freedoms, as it was, were clearly at the fringe or beyond the fringe of the jurisdiction of the entity. That's what the DC Circuit said. And even the second go-around was apparently, in some material respects, beyond the pale, or the method was beyond the pale of the agency's jurisdiction. So I think that from the standpoint of a regulated industry, the problem with threats is that it's very hard to find your day in court. How do you get your justice when you're existing under a regime of threat at the fringe of the regulator's jurisdiction? So it's a very interesting and complicated, aspect to weigh along. And I think that as long as we have administrative agencies, you always want to try to have the best relationship possible with your regulator, right? It's common sense. And you spend a lot of time thinking about, well, geez, do I sue over this? These are not easy decisions to make. I can tell you, I will never forget the name of the last lawsuit. It's been branded on me many times. So I think that these are very tough decisions to make. They're not taken lightly. They're taken when you feel like there's an existential issue. There's a very important issue at stake. Because you know that gaining the trust of your regulator in the sense that you can present them evidence, they have over time realized that you're not going to try to slide one past them, is just very important for any advocate, right? That's what every advocate, no matter what body you're arguing in front of, lives for. Whoever's making the decision is going to say, this person's an honest person. They're not going to try to slide one past me. It's very important, and I think that those are critical relationships that if you spend your time in a heavily regulated industry, you have to strive for. That's the aspect of capture. I think that's capture. I don't think there's any way about it, right? Because anyway by it, I think it would be included in the larger category of capture, but I think it's a salutary aspect of capture.
So I'm going to have to interrupt, I'm sorry, because we have to give
Okay.
the students a chance to ask some questions in the audience as well. So, which student wants to ask this great panel a question? And I don't know who to call on, so, we need a student first. Sorry.
But jeez.
Professors?
Ethan.
Oh, who is so distinguished himself.
So returning to something Mr. Milch mentioned at the beginning, we heard Chairwoman Ramirez earlier call for Congress to remove the common carriage exemption from 15 U.S.C. 45. And I'm curious what the other panelists think about overlapping agency jurisdiction, how that affects sort of a jurisprudence for innovation, especially in terms of Ray's typography's predictability.
I'm a big fan of overlapping jurisdiction. Different agencies do different things, and if you look back at the history of telecom, it's really interesting. The Interstate Commerce Act was applied to the telecom industry in 1910 with the Mann-Elkins Act. 4 years later, one of the first consent decrees under the Sherman Act was entered into by AT&T, and they did different things. We had a final judgment and a modification of final judgment. It was antitrust that broke the monopoly up. The regulator could never have done that. But antitrust hates to do day-to-day regulation. They're not going to do behavioral regulation. They're not going to worry. They can't attack market power that's legally obtained, industry, et cetera. And yet there are consequences. So the two have fed off of one another. And let's be clear. The 96 Act was intended to formalize, institutionalize two massively important acts by two separate agencies. The breakup and the development of the common carrier principles, enhanced services, and the entire data industry. And so it solidified that. And you would not necessarily have gotten those two really important developments with a single agency jurisdiction.
Yeah, but at what point is it just piling on? And one that makes me think of that is the CFPB recently going after I forget who for, I think it was cramming. I'm sorry, I don't have better facts than that. And that is, was it Sprint? Okay. It was identical issues that the FCC and the FTC have tackled. All of a sudden now we also have to worry about what the CFPB is doing. You know, you really have to be a very well-resourced company to be able to address all of these regulatory enforcement.
So I think you have to split it up into its various categories. It's one thing to talk. Enforcement is a separate issue, right? I think there's an issue with enforcement these days among administrative agencies, and I think that has to be tackled. If you're talking about day-to-day administrative regulation of an area, I think that there are clear inefficiencies associated with having the FCC have a privacy policy and the FTC have a privacy policy. I don't see how that is not an issue that should be dealt with. You know, I think our approach, Verizon's approach originally was that you know, from the net neutrality front in particular, we years ago put net neutrality principles out on our website and said pledge that we would abide by them, particularly to subject ourselves to FTC jurisdiction over whether we were living up to them or not. Right? We felt like we would put ourselves out there, we would say what we were doing, we would be bound by them, and people would have the ability to seek redress, and the agency would have the ability to seek redress if we weren't living up to those things. Now, I think if we're going to face a Title II regime, you know, it would be. I think that the existence or the non-existence of the exemption has to fall into a larger framework of correcting the entire legal framework for the system. I don't think you would do that alone. I think that if you had a rewrite of the Telecom Act and you had an expansion or contraction so that everyone in the ecosystem was treated fairly and equally, and at that point you might want to divvy up jurisdiction between relevant agencies and make some decisions. But I think at this point, only getting rid of the exemption in the face of a Title II regime, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me as the only stop.
I'll agree, two agencies doing the same thing doesn't make any sense. But if they're doing different things, then it may well make sense because they have a different portfolio and a different view. And so, but I'll agree, I don't need two agencies. I need a privacy policy. It's not clear I have one from either agency, let's be clear.
All right, well, I think we're out of time. Yeah. All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our session speakers for the excellent